get up and running. Okay, our next guest is from the National Archives, which is the UK's government's official archive. Their main duties are to preserve government records and set standards in information management and reuse. TNA also run legislation.gov.uk, which carries most, but not all types of legislation and their accompanying explanatory documents. Catherine is going to kindly talk to us today about the background of legislation.gov.uk, how it's structured, and hopefully give us a demonstration of the website as well. So pass over to you, Catherine.
Thank you. So hopefully you can now see my screen. So as mentioned, I'm Catherine Tabone. I'm the data scientist in the Legislation Services team at the National Archives, and Legislation Services are responsible for legislation.gov.uk, and my team are responsible for the data content on legislation.gov, as well as providing support for people who want to use our data. So I'm going to try and provide a practical guide to the data on legislation.gov and how to find it and use it. So I'm going to attempt a live demo of the website, so we have to hope that the demo gods are smiling on me. But all of these things are in a slide pack as well, which I can circulate afterwards. So if you want to look at any of the links or any of the notes, then it's all there. So if you can't see anything at any moment, please give me a shout. So if we start out by looking at the website, which I'm hoping you've all probably seen before. So this is developed and maintained by us, and the principle of open data is core to our services. So we aim to share all our data, and this website was built with the reuse of public data in mind. So the making our data available is integral to how the site works, and we actively encourage people to take our data away and reuse it either commercially or through other research purposes. So we're going to have a little look at different things you can do with the website and how you can see the underlying data, as well as taking a bit of a sneak preview at some other services that we're developing that aren't yet public. So first we're going to look at how to find legislation, which you're probably all aware of. So we have 3 different ways we can find legislation. We can use the quick search bar to pick a title, a type, or a number, and we get some content. There we go. We have some list of documents. If we want to do some slightly more sophisticated searching, we can search for words within the text, and we can select specific types of legislation. We can also use the browse functionality if we want to see lists of documents. So if we look at this as a list of UK statutory instruments, and we have some facets if we want to narrow down our list, as well as just listing what we've got here. If we're interested specifically in new legislation, we have a specific list of things, so we can see all of the things that were published recently. And if we now have a little look at what this would be if we wanted to see the underlying data. So if we go back to our list of UKSIs, and all of the data that's underpinning this page is available through our API. So if we add data.feed to this URI, we will see that this is the data that this service is based on. So everything that you can see on the web page has been generated from this data. And if we go down here a little bit, we can see that each of the things that we saw in our list is an entry in this feed, and we can see all of the information about its URI, its title, its link. And this principle is true for every list of documents on the website. The same principle applies. So if you want to find the underlying data, the same information is available for everything we can look at. So now if we have a look at some documents instead of some lists, so if we were to search, say, for 2011 number 1, KPGA, so oops. Let's look at the table of contents first. So when you navigate to a new document, the first thing you'll see is the table of contents. And this is, again, a significant part of our navigation for the site, that for each document, for each level within each document, we have a specific URI, so you can navigate to an individual section of a document, or you can navigate to a whole part of it, or if you want to see all of it, that's all available. So if we look at, for example, part 2, we can see the text of this section, and we can see all of the previous versions of this section too, as well as seeing the original version. It's worth mentioning that these versions are created by the legislation editorial team as part of their work to consolidate amendments. And this is the version that doesn't have any editorial markup in. So we store our legislation documents as XML conforming to our own schema, which we call Crown Legislation Markup Language. And we use XML because it suits the highly structured nature of legislation content. And there is a dynamic transformation that takes the XML that's stored in the database and creates this page when you request it. So this page is being dynamically created out of the data in the database. And if we add the extension data.xml to the end of this URI, we can see the underlying data. And so this is all available to access. And again, everything that we saw on the web page is stored within this data. So if we have a little look through to see how this is structured, we can see that we're starting out with some metadata, some identifiers. We have some information about when this file was edited. All of the versions of this document are self-referential, so everything refers to everything else, so we can see all of the alternative formats and versions of this document, as well as some general metadata before we actually get into the text of the document. And this principle, again, applies to every document on the website, every section of every document at every level, and the same is true for the table of contents. So if you want to access the table of contents as XML, you can do that too. And if you're interested in exploring our schema, it's also online, referenced at the top of the document as schema XSD. And there's some documentation which I'll share a link for as well, which we are in the process of rewriting. But if you'd like to look at the draft documentation, that's all available too. So if you want to understand how all this works. And as well as XML content, we also make our data available in a couple of other formats. So we provide a generated PDF version for people who wanted a paginated view. We provide some XML snippets if you want to see some unstyled HTML. And we provide an alternative XML version. So I think we've already mentioned the Akomantosa XML standard, which is an international standard for representing legal documents in XML. And we know that a lot of people are using this, so we provide this as an alternative format. Our own CLML XML is slightly richer, and obviously that schema was created specifically for our content, so it's slightly easier to work with. But if you're used to this, then this is sometimes a little bit simpler and it's more standardized. In addition to our Akomantosa XML format, we also provide an alternative HTML format. So this is an HTML5 format that tries to combine some of the best features of XML and the best features of the HTML. That in general, the XML provides a very good semantic information, but it doesn't have any formatting, whereas the HTML provides formatting without any semantic information. So this format attempts to do both by pulling all of the Akomantosa XML markup into the HTML as metadata. So we have one format that has everything all together. If you're interested in reusing any of the transformations that take XML into any of these other formats, they're all available publicly under our Open Government license. And I will share the link to the GitHub repository that contains all of those. So we've now looked at how to find the data and how to access the data. So now we're going to look a little bit about how these document versions have been created. So when a new item of legislation is published, our editorial team will review the document and identify any places within it where it makes a change to existing law. So if we look at an example, we're now going to go and look at the Parliamentary Constituencies Act. And we're going to have a look at section 11. And in section 11, we can see that there is an instruction to omit section 14 of the Parliamentary Voting System and Constituencies Act 2011. And so in our editorial terminology, we would call this an effect. And the primary job for the editorial team is to identify all of these effects, and they get recorded as data in their own right, which we can see on the changes to legislation page. So if we complete this form to talk about the affecting and the affected document that we've just seen, and here at the bottom, we can see our effect that the Parliamentary Constituencies Act 2020, section 11, omits section 14 from the Parliamentary Voting Systems Act. And as with all of the rest of the website, the underlying data for this page is available too. If we add data.feed to the end of this URI, we can see all of the underlying data for the effects. And if we go right to the bottom, we'll see the one we were just looking at. And each entry in this feed is an effect. And you can probably see that there's a much richer set of information in the underlying data than we were seeing on the web page. So we have much more information about when this has come into force, the document that provided the commencement date for this effect, as well as some extra information about savings and whether this effect has been applied and how it was created. So if we return to our effects again, we can see that this effect has been marked as being applied, and the job of the legislation editorial team, once the effect is identified and we've identified the date that this effect comes into force, in this case, the 31st of the 5th, 2020, the carrying through of this effect is what has created this version. And we now see from our commentary that we've recorded what happened and why. Again, if we look at the XML for this section, we can see all of the information about the effect being removed and the commentary detailing all of the references. It can sometimes take some time for our editorial team to apply effects. So if we've identified effects but they haven't been carried through yet, this information would appear at the top of the document instead as a marker to say this is something that hasn't been applied yet. These are really the founding principles of the data on the website, that we have documents and we have effects that create new versions of documents. So now we're going to have a little look at a new service that we're creating to add information into the website. So we are always looking to add more data to legislation.gov. And one of our new services is to create a linked data API, which will provide information not just to documents, but to metadata about documents. So we've created a new RDF database that collates all of the information we have about legislation, both the documents that we have on the website and documents that we don't. And we're gathering information from some of our internal systems, our publishing system that manages the creation of new legislation, as well as our editorial system that manages the creation of these new versions. So, and we can see a little bit of this by finding a document. And this time, if we add metadata to the end of the URI, we get to see the metadata view for this document, and we can see some information about this document. And this is data coming from our new service. And you can see that this information is accessible in a range of other formats as well. So this is currently a beta service, but if you want access, we have created some links for you to some credentials, sorry, for you to experiment with, which I'll circulate. And there's only one data collection so far that we've created, but we think of it as quite a significant collection. That we've created a core reference data set, which is a list of all of the legislation that has ever been made in the UK, which sounds like it should be something straightforward, but is more complicated than it sounds, because legislation publishing has only been digital from the late 80s onwards. So everything before that was paper-based publishing, and as far as we know, nobody has digitized quite everything, and nobody has a complete digital list. So we did an exercise to try and combine all of the sources of information that we could come up with to create as complete a list of every piece of legislation that has ever been in the UK from 1235 to the present day. And you can access this information through the API. We also have a Sparkle endpoint, so our data to query the data directly. And if you're interested in playing with this, there's also some documentation about the API and the ontology that goes along with this, which is public. And again, I will circulate all of the links. And so once we've created our list of everything, we're now working to add data collections to this service. So we're currently working to add in information about publishing of what documents published and when. We expect to add more metadata collections to the service, particularly around things like document subjects, what's in force, what isn't, what's been repealed, which documents have been worked on by our editorial team, and a whole range of other data sets that we're hoping will drive new services on the website, as well as providing extra information for the public. And lastly, we're going to look at another new service that we're generating. So this service, which is also in our beta state, but again, we've created some temporary credentials that you can use to play around with it if you'd like. So the legislation research website is a sister website to the legislation.gov, and it's aimed to provide research services for people who are interested in researching legislation, whether commercial, academic, or government. And we've tried to create some tools that make it easier for people to use data on the website. So both providing easier access for people who want to take the data away and reuse it, and some analytics tools to help people to understand it. So at the moment, there are 3 areas of functionality. The first one is fairly straightforward, and this is our bulk data download service. So for people who would like to reuse data from the main website, it can be a bit complicated to write crawlers to go through and find all the documents and extract them all. So we've tried to make it easy for people by providing some pre-created zip files that contain sets of documents. So depending on the version you want, whether you'd like original versions or whether you'd like the current revised versions or whether you'd like maybe historic versions, and which of our various formats you'd be interested in, we have subsets of data that, so hopefully, so we can say, I want to download a copy of the CLML, XML original documents for all of the acts of the National Welsh Assembly for 2020, and we can do that in one go rather than having to extract them for the database. And it's also worth noting that there's a format here that's available that wasn't available on the main website. We know that people who want to analyze legislation content sometimes like plain text instead of HTML or XML. So we've created some plain text versions of our documents, and some that have all of the text and some that only have operative text, where we've taken out things like headings and preambles, so that if you want to do text analysis of just the core document, there are some files available. And can also download all of the legislative amendment data. So when we looked at the data on the changes to legislation pages, again, if you're interested in finding all of those effects or all of the effects to a particular type of legislation, you can do that from here rather than having to track through all of the feeds. So 2 other services that are available on here are the Query Builder and the Words Explorer. So look at the Query Builder first. So this is an enhanced search service that runs against the same data as on the main website, and it provides the freedom to query against all of the XML content without having to know any XQuery, in theory. So we can search based on the structure of the underlying data. So we can have a little look at some examples. So this is a sample query where we're asking for documents that published from 2013 onwards, and we're interested in documents where the introductory section contains a reference to Section 2.2 of the European Communities Act. So here we have our list, which we can download in a variety of formats. And you can see that we have much more sophisticated searching that we can now do. This query is particularly useful to find documents made as part of our obligations to the European Union. To look at a slightly different example, we can, as well as searching, we can also count. So this query is looking at secondary legislation published from 2015 onwards, and we're grouping by departments and years. So from this query, we can see how many documents each government department published. We can also see where they failed to spell their own name correctly, because this data is coming directly from the documents. And we can do quite detailed searches here of what's in the content. So if we use an example, if I want paragraphs that contain headings that have the word commencement in them, and I'm interested in particularly public acts, whoops. I can now find all of the commencement provisions from PGAs for 2021. So this service provides a much more powerful search than the website, and if you're interested in trying it, we also provide a guide here that lists all of the different syntax, all the different possibilities and combinations that you can use. So our last service is the Words Explorer. And this is a different database that's derived from the content on legislation.gov, and this is an n-grams database where we count the frequency of words within legislation, and we count the frequency of single words, pairs of words, triples of words, and up to 5. So which is probably most obvious if we try an example. So if we look for the word reasonable in our words in content, oops, which is probably not going to work. There we go. It's worth noting, if you do play with this, that we haven't updated the EU data, so it may not. You may have to pick which type you search on. So here we can see all of the different ways that the word reasonable appears within legislation, and we can see the most common. So the majority of triple words with the word reasonable in is this, and this is the highest ranking one. So we get a sense of how words are used, or how phrases of words are used in legislation. We can also count the words in legislation. So if we pick one of our examples here, we can plot the frequency of certain words. So we can see how common, in this case, the words he, she, and they are. And we can get a sense of how the frequency has changed over time. So if we go back to our, so this time I'm looking at, whoops, how common the word European is in UKSIs, and I get a sense of political history. So I think that's probably all to show you for now. So I think maybe I'll stop sharing and see if we have any questions.
Thank you very much for showing us all of that, Catherine. That was really interesting to see how that works. Could I just ask a question on behalf of myself to start with? What sort of future steps is TNA undertaking to sort of exploit and use this data?
So we We're aware that there are a whole range of questions in government, that there are always people who want to know how many documents have this in them, can we find this information? So we're really looking to build up our research capabilities so that we can make sure that these tools provide what we're looking for. And we're also looking to make some more data sets to help people things. So we know there's interest in, for example, how many people access certain things on our website. So we will look to integrate things like our website statistics data sets, and to maybe package up some other data that people can reuse. We also have a program of work to add more information into our XML, so there's more we can search on.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'll open up the floor for questions. If anybody doesn't want to pop on camera and ask one, feel free to post in the chat or just ask away. Go ahead, Ray.
Thank you, and thank you, Catherine, for taking us through that. It's really helpful to have an expert talk you through these services, because there's lots of nuances you can miss when you're doing it yourself. So that was really fantastic. My question is really about, I'm curious about collaborations, really. I mean, it's evident from the services that you guys are providing and the way that you talk about it, that the focus is on, opening up this data to, the general public, and also to other kind of entities that would be interested in doing work with that knowledge, that information, and working on their own projects. And I was wondering if there's any maybe external collaborations or even internal projects that you could talk about that you think are exciting, that are making use of this data.
I guess one of the things that we have been looking at, that you may be aware that the National Archives is now publishing case law on our sister website. So something we are going to start to look at is how we link our two services together so that we can make better connections between case law and legislation. And we have been working with some other government departments as well to see how some of our categorizations, information and experience of legislation can maybe help them to answer policy questions, or to find it easier to get to the data they need.
That's really great, thank you.
Paul, I think you've got a question. Go ahead.
Hi there, thank you for that. I'm a drafter, and it's my job to make legislation clear. And what I don't know sometimes is whether the ultimate user of legislation is finding what I'm writing clear or not. And I just wondered whether there was any way you could use your searches or your capability of doing searches of finding out, perhaps by using proxy terms, I don't know, finding out where users are struggling to understand legislation. Is any common points where ultimate users struggle, or where we're not doing our job as drafters of making things clear?
There could be. I mean, I think there would probably be some opportunities to talk to our editorial team, because obviously if they have to read and understand and apply amendments. So if there are things that the team of legal editors are struggling with, those are probably things that are generally going to be difficult. I think we have tried to do some analysis of how people understand legislation in a few different ways. So we have some quite extensive user research where we want to make sure the data on the website is as clear as possible. So we do run regular research to find out, are people understanding what they're looking at? do they understand how the documents relate to each other? Do they understand the changes? So we get a sense of where people are struggling. We did some work, I think, with OPC some time ago to compare some different drafting patterns of the same thing to see if some people find one way easier than the others. And the other thing that we have started to do is to analyze our website statistics. So we have a huge set of information of who looks at what, when, and how, and why, because we get several million users per day. So we can see if somebody looked at a particular section, did they look at another section of this document, or did they look at something briefly and then go and look at 5 other documents, or did they look at it for only 10 seconds and then run away? So something I think we'd like to do in the future is to see if we can understand better how people are using the data and how they interact with it. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes, no, that research you did a few years ago was very illuminating as a drafter, because people really struggled with stuff which as drafters we treat as second nature, because we just kind of get used to doing that, and just watching people, as you say, struggle with things which we don't realize are a problem was very illuminating. So yeah, it's exactly that sort of thing, kind of more of that, and feeding it directly back to drafters so that we know we can adjust our product accordingly. So yeah.
I mean, there might be some interest at some point in looking at some of our natural language processing. So we have a NLP process that our editorial team use to identify amendments. So we've created a set of rules to try and extract amendment information, and then they check it before it gets used. But the things that the machine gets wrong are usually the things that people also get wrong, because they're things where it's maybe phrased in a way that wouldn't be expected, or something that's not how everything else is done. So at some point it might be interesting to compare that information and to see if that correlates to improvements that could be made.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Claire. You're on mute, Claire.
That's a great start, isn't it? I was just saying thank you really to Catherine, because it was amazing seeing that. I just wondered, do you know, have any sense of who uses this data and what they use it for?
So we've actually been doing some research to try and better understand our users recently, and I think there are a range of different people who reuse our data. One of them is the commercial legal publishers, that they all get our data from us. So for people like LexisNexis and Westlaw, they start out with our data and they take it away and do other things, but their services are based on our data. And similarly for smaller RegTech firms who want to provide specialist services for analysing or improving on certain aspects of law, they also use our data. We know that there are other academic researchers who will reuse our data, as well as people who are archiving it and generally just indexing it.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I have one more that's just a question of curiosity more than anything. On your sister research site, the Word Explorer, does it have the functionality to search in Welsh?
I don't think it does at the moment, but it could. So I think at the moment the documents that have been indexed will probably be the English versions, just for consistency, so that it's a set of all of the English versions of all of the original documents. So we try to keep it consistent and not use and revise things. But there's no particular reason it couldn't have a Welsh subset. So I think if there was interest, I don't think it would be too difficult for us to add that.
Okay, thank you very much. Natalie, you've got your hand up.
Hello, yes. Thanks, Catherine, for your really interesting talk. I'm Natalie Lancy from the Welsh Government's Legislative Drafting Office. There's in the browse legislation section of legislation.gov, there's the useful facility to browse. There's DEFRA-Lex, where you can browse legislation managed by DEFRA by category. I was just wondering, were there any plans to implement that sort of browsing by category system more widely across legislation.gov?
And I think that's something that we've been looking into, and we know that there's interest in categorizing or creating taxonomies and subject groups or department groupings for legislation. I mean, I think we have our challenge for that is that if we were to group things just by the department that issued something, that information is in the data itself, so that's relatively easy. What the DEFRA-Lex project was trying to do was to look at the current set of legislation that DEFRA is responsible for, which is not necessarily the same as who made it in the first place, and that requires some human curation to create that data set. So if we can find a way to curate that kind of data so that we can keep it up to date, that's something that we'd be quite interested to do. And we know that there are other government departments who are interested in that. We also know that there's a lot of interest in subject classifications of data. So that's something that we are looking at how we might do that in a way that would be useful to people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, does anybody else have any further questions for Catherine? I can't see anything else in the chat. So I think we'll just say thank you to you, Catherine. That was a really wonderful presentation, and I was incredibly impressed that you were able to navigate the website and narrate alongside. We'll just take a short coffee break just now, if that's all right, and we'll be coming back at 2:30 for a presentation with James George and Claire Fife from the Welsh Government. So I'll see you all at 2:30 if that's all right.